Hi, welcome to our monthly webinar. I'm Christian, the founder of Blue Goat Cyber. We're also here with Trevor Slattery. He's our CTO. And today we're going to be covering risk assessment. Last webinar, we talked about risk management. Risk assessment says component of risk management is necessary to do risk assessment before you can manage the risk. So our focus today is on risk assessment and what's unique about risk assessments for medical devices, because it's very different than traditional cybersecurity risk assessment. We have to look at it through the lens of patient safety and exploitability instead of likelihood and a few other variables. So Trevor's going to bring up a slide deck. We'll go ahead and get started here, and we'll walk through it. And as he's going through it, if I have any questions or I feel like there's areas for clarity, I'll jump in, and then we'll take some questions from the audience towards the end as well. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll turn it over to you, Trevor.
So, like you mentioned, we're going to be going over risk assessments. Before we get into what the process is, especially when relating to a medical device, we'll talk about how this ties into risk management. So when we're looking at the overall risk management part, or the overall risk management process, risk assessment is a single part of that. It's a very complex part and a very important part. And what we're trying to do is identify a problem and evaluate what the actual outcome can be, what is the impact, and what needs to be done about it. It may be the case that so many different findings are coming in, they're all ranked a different score by all these different scanners, but when really looking at it from a practical perspective, turns out that a risk assessment may increase or decrease the overall risk just based off of certain criteria. This is especially the case with medical devices, as it's focused more on patient harm and patient data loss, which isn't necessarily captured by traditional metrics. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at is what is the process for risk scoring. So risk scoring is really the intersection of exploitability and impact. We'll get more into details on how we calculate both of those, but impact is essentially the outcome. How bad is this problem? What can happen if this is successfully exploited? It doesn't look at what process needs to be taken to realize this vulnerability. It simply just assumes that this happens. The attacker knows how to exploit it. They're able to do it reliably. What's that outcome? That outcome may be very high, maybe very low, and that's why we're looking at the intersection of exploitability. A very low impact finding, but something super easy to reproduce, something very exploitable, may be ranked higher than something with a little bit more severity on the impact side, but it's nearly impossible for an attacker to realize it. Now, exploitability is defining the avenue of attack. It's an objective method, and it's important to think of exploitability, not a term like likelihood or probability. Something like probability is very common with a lot of risk assessments, especially when looking at more traditional cybersecurity. That's saying we believe there is a 1 in 10,000 chance of this attack getting realized. A different security researcher might say, I think it's a 1 in 100,000 chance. And both of them are going to have a good reason and defend that point. When we're looking at exploitability, we'll get into the actual metrics that we cover, but we're looking at very objective situations. An example of one is what level of privilege is required. There's no room for interpretation here. Everyone is going to come to the same conclusion when looking at these factors. As I had mentioned earlier, risk scoring for a medical device is going to be different from traditional risk scoring. We're looking at patient impact from a safety perspective as well as a data perspective, which is usually going to be more that security side. With that in mind, we're going to have a lot of different outcomes that might not be applicable for a traditional network test. A certain finding that could be critical for a network test isn't necessarily going to have any impact to a patient, so it might get brought down to a medium or a low. Inversely, there could be some findings that on a traditional network aren't really going to cause too many problems, a little bit of information leakage here or there, something like that. But in a medical context, if this is leaking protected health information, that's a huge problem. So that might get massively ticked up as far as the overall outcome. The FDA states that risk scoring criteria should be objective. Multiple assessors should come to the same conclusion. This is tying back into that point on exploitability. This is not something where we should go in and I should have a different opinion on that impact as opposed to another researcher. Anyone
So,
should come.
so let me jump in here. So you're saying that exploitability is super objective because we're using CVSS and actually numbers versus probability, which is very subjective, right?
Exactly. Yes. So on the next slide, we'll get into, I think it's the next slide, we'll get into what the factors that go into exploitability are. These should always be the same across anyone assessing this.
Yeah, and
Similarly, impact needs to
sorry.
follow that.
So one of the thing I think I want to just hone in on is uh there's patient data like HIPAA, right? We talk about HIPAA data, PHI, protected health information, but there's also patient safety. And when we're looking at risk scoring, which one would be higher risk, the disclosure of data or patient safety for medical devices?
Well, it can depend. So, in general, patient safety, of course, has to be the top concern. If someone can get hurt because of vulnerability, that's a massive problem. Having said that, let's say that the impact for a patient safety perspective would be like a paper cut, for example. I don't know how a medical device would necessarily give you a paper cut from a cybersecurity vulnerability, but just for the hypothetical situation, compared to hundreds of thousands of medical records getting disclosed, obviously the patient data in this situation is going to be a more severe example. So, determining which is worse, that is something that might be a little bit subjective, especially when that line isn't quite as clear. What's important is that there's just an easy to assign, number or word to it. We try to say low, medium, high, severe, critical. If we can assign a number to it and based on our criteria, someone else can assign that same criteria to it, that means that we're doing our job correct with our risk matrix. All right, so now we can look a little bit more about what goes into exploitability. So, again, this is that objective metric for determining how an attack can occur. This looks at what situations have to line up for an attacker to realize that threat. So, what are the different things that they are going to have to control? What things are out of their control to make this happen? It's distinct and should not be used interchangeably with likelihood and probability. Like we said, both of those are subjective metrics. CVSS 3.0 uses exploitability factors when it's calculating risk. This is called out by the FDA as preferred for the exploitability metrics, though it is possible to provide other solutions if you have a good rationale. We like to use CVSS 3.0. It's a standardized process, and it's something that a lot of people, not necessarily even familiar with medtech security, just in the security field in general, will be familiar with CVSS. So CVSS is looking at the attack vector. So what level of access you need to get? Is it over the network? Is it physical access? The complexity, what's out of the attacker's control? Privileges required. Can you do it with credentials or no credentials? And do you need user interaction? Yes or no? So there are a lot of different options for each of these, with certain things being usually more a higher up on this list. Like with the attack vector, if it's going to be network as opposed to physical, that's going to give this a larger exploitability factor. The higher an exploitability factor is, the easier it is for an attacker to pull this off. So when we're looking at attack vector, network is across the internet. That means that, you know, you can be sitting in Arizona and attack a computer in New York. That is just across the internet, open, and that's going to be a lot easier. A lot more people are going to have access to that. Where if you're looking at physical, you need to physically get your hands on the device. Far fewer people are going to have that level of access. You need to be in the same building, in the same room as the device. And so that massively cuts down on how likely an attack is when looking at these metrics. Similarly, just looking through any of these with the complexity, a low complexity, the attacker determines the conditions, and a high complexity, the conditions are out of the attacker's control. It could be that the attack only works at a certain time due to some weird artifact in the code. And the attacker isn't necessarily able to pin down what that time is. They aren't sure when it works. They just know that sometimes it works. So that's an inconsistent attack. All of these just consider a few different areas to get an accurate score. With CVSS 3.0, this assigns a number value when you tick off each one of these sections. It is on a range from 0 to 4, with 0 being impossible. There is no way to exploit it, and 4 being it's very easy. The attacker controls everything, no credentials needed. They can do it over the open internet, and they don't need any user interaction. All right, once we're able to understand the exploitability, we can start looking at the impact as well. So the impact is the result of successful exploitation. Traditionally, we're looking at the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. These are pretty standard as far as security. And so most cybersecurity professionals are going to know these and have heard about them 100 times. Its confidentiality is looking at keeping data safe and secure so that nobody unauthorized can access it. Integrity is ensuring that information or a system or a process has not been tampered with. And availability is making sure that no denial of service attacks can be executed against the device. All of these are still, of course, important to consider from a security perspective when looking at a medical device. However, the FDA is not as concerned about these as they may be with things like patient harm and PHI loss. If there is a way for an attacker to modify a process in the device and it's not sure what the outcome is, of course, that's going to be a problem. But if there's a way for an attacker to cause direct harm to the user of the device, that is going to be the top concern. So, really, we need to prioritize things based on what the actual outcome can be to the patient. This may let certain vulnerabilities that would otherwise be a huge problem get downgraded a little bit just because we're really trying to focus on that patient safety aspect. This is not to say that these things get swept under the rug if they can't explicitly cause harm to a patient or PHI loss. It just means that they're less of a priority as opposed to the findings that do have that effect. So, everyone has their own risk methodology. There are a lot of standardized approaches out here. Blue Goat has a custom approach that we have developed and we have great success with when going through these 510K submissions or PMA submissions, really anything on the regulatory side. We have the intersection between the CVSS 3.0 exploitability and then our impact. So looking at the exploitability, I mentioned earlier, this goes on a scale from 0 to 4. Here we can plug in the value that we get out of a CVSS calculator and assign it to our risk matrix here. We'll just find the intersection based on what the actual outcome of a finding is, with minor up to significant, ranging from minor inconvenience, nothing to be too worried about, all the way to potential patient death, to determine what the overall outcome of this is. Like I said, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. There are a lot of different approaches to take. This is simply what we take. We've had good success with it in the past, but there can be many different variations of something like this. All right, so now we're understanding how we calculate vulnerabilities. We need to look at how we get in these vulnerabilities. So a risk assessment should be a mandatory process for a vulnerability. That's part of an overall risk management framework based on ISO 14971 or TIR57 for safety and security, respectively. We want to take anything and feed it through the same process so that it's always going to get the same treatment. Any finding is going to get the same treatment, and it's going to get that same objective outcome. Now, when we're looking at these vulnerability sources, they can vary a little bit between the pre-market and the post-market phase. In the pre-market phase, you don't have a fielded device yet. There aren't as many external notifications that you can pull in information from. So you're usually going to look at stuff just through security testing against the device. This can be a vulnerability assessment and penetration test, static testing, dynamic testing, fuzz testing, analysis of the SBOM to look for any vulnerabilities in the supply chain. This, of course, is not an exhaustive list. There could be security requirement testing, but these are the main areas that you're going to find vulnerabilities in the pre-market phase. So when you have a device, but it hasn't been fielded. After the fact, once you have a device that's cleared by the FDA, it's out in the market, everything from pre-market will still apply. You're still expected to go through regular penetration testing, static testing, all of this. But additionally, you'll be able to get in information from external notifications like the FDA notifications or HISAC. There can be some notifications on a recall issued by the FDA. As part of the FDA requirements, you have to push out a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program. This lets security researchers bring in independent information if they find a problem in your device. They'll reach out to you, they'll explain what they found, and you can go back and forth on a remediation if you determine it to be a true positive finding. So Once a device is fielded, you have a few more options for getting in these vulnerability sources. Part of why these vulnerability disclosure programs are required is exactly for that fact. You're able to just get in a wider perspective and a lot more information. The security community cares a lot about trying to make sure that we're living in a little bit of a safer world. So, a lot of times, security researchers are just going to try to find problems in these devices purely so they can tell the manufacturers and help them out a little bit. So, it's great to have a few more sources once a device has been pushed out into the field. All right. Once we have a assessment done, there can be a few different things that happen as the outcome. So once the assessment is done, we're going to have an applicable finding. That means something that we realize, okay, yeah, this is an actual true positive finding. We need to fix this. We can also have a not applicable finding. Oftentimes, when you're running a bunch of scanners and tools, they're going to spit out tons and tons of results. And a lot of these tools are prone to false positives. That's part of why it's very important to do a thorough penetration test and verification of any findings on top of just running scanners. I know a lot of people talk about an automated penetration test that you can get with just some tool. It's never going to be very comprehensive. It doesn't verify these findings. So when you're verifying whether or not a finding can actually affect a device, you get the true outcome there. Oftentimes, this can rule out a massive percentage of findings. Sometimes a static testing tool will pick up on just a test script folder and return 100 findings from there, none of which apply because it's just for test scripts. So, going through these findings and really figuring out what's happening is important so that you can understand where to put priorities. After this assessment is done, there can be two more things for any applicable findings. They can either be fixed or they can be not fixed. A finding that is not fixed needs to meet a certain criteria and it needs to have a rationale. So if I identify a finding in a device that I think would be a low severity, it might not need a remediation as much as something with a medium or a high severity. So sorting these out, determining what is an acceptable level of risk, and this criteria is going to be different for everyone. Each manufacturer is going to have its own opinion on what's an acceptable level of risk. I know it. Blue Goat, we are, of course, the security professionals, so our acceptable level of risk is very, very, very low. But oftentimes we like to take the proactive approach to try to clean everything out of a device. That's not always required. Sometimes there can be some minor findings that don't really have too much of an impact. And if there are a lot of constraints on remediation for them, it's not the top priority to get them fixed. Still important to make note of them. They should be logged back into an unresolved anomaly, but they aren't the top priority to remediate. After all this is done, we've determined what is acceptable risk, what isn't, remediated what we can, and we haven't remediated what we can't. Everything should be documented, logged, and mapped back to the threat modeling. So this is part of that traceability that the FDA requires, and we'll get a little bit more into the exact specifics on that traceability here. But essentially, the threat modeling should tie directly into the risk assessment. Anything that we find in that risk assessment should come out of that threat modeling. We should have come up with this problem as a hypothetical. We're able to map that back to the results. So we'll start with a threat. We have our test case to verify whether or not that threat is real. We go from there into the risk assessment outcome. Did we find something? Yes or no? Was it fixed? Yes or no? And what's that final score look like? Why is that final score acceptable? So start to finish in the risk management process, we need to have traceability. Once we have everything scored, everything traced back to that threat modeling, we just want to keep everything logged. So again, for part of this traceability, we want to make sure that we aren't letting anything go missing or we forget, oh, what were those findings? Everything should be logged in a risk register. Anything that isn't fixed should be tied back into an unresolved anomaly. Since it is still part of the system, it is strange behavior that should be remembered. It may be the case that, for an example, a component of the SBOM has a vulnerability, but there's no public exploit code. Nobody knows how to really exploit the vulnerability, and so it just gets logged as an unresolved anomaly. Eventually, a security researcher develops a proof of concept exploit and publishes it on GitHub. Suddenly, this vulnerability is a big problem. Anyone who can find that device is able to exploit it just because there's public code for it now. So with this getting logged as an unresolved anomaly in continuous review, it can get pushed out and escalated from something acceptable to unacceptable. and that lets you prioritize remediating it. So, continuous monitoring of anything that is not fixed is critical when looking at a risk assessment. All right. So, when we're looking at the vulnerability scope, vulnerabilities can manifest in a few different ways as far as where the impact is. It's not necessarily going to be the entire device, it might be a single functionality or a single component. And we need to assess risk at a few different levels to get an accurate understanding. So we can start by looking at the finding in a vacuum. What is the problem just with this? Nothing else, no other situations considered. We look at what happens if you exploit that finding and the outcome just only with that finding. We don't look at any other functionalities. We look at a limited scope to understand exactly what's going on. This is great to figure out just an isolated impact. If everything else is fixed, what's the outcome here? The reason we need to go a little bit deeper is it's very important for the FDA to look at vulnerability chaining, which is essentially tying together several vulnerabilities to make an impact greater than the sum of its parts. Now, when we look at a component at the combination of findings, we're looking at a single functionality with every single finding involved. This could be, let's say there are a couple problems in a login page where there's problem one is there's no rate limiting. So you can do as many login requests as you want. Problem two is their password requirements are weak. So you only need 6 characters and they have no other rules. Problem three is it sends you a different error message if you get the password or the username right or the username wrong. All of this in combination can work out to a pretty big problem, but individually, they're not as much of a concern. So we're looking at a single functionality, seeing how we can tie all these different vulnerabilities together and really understand what we can do. In addition to looking at it at the functionality or the component level, we need to look at it at the device level. So after we understand every vulnerability in a system, we take it all in combination, look at the device, and understand exactly what can happen to the device. What happens if we chain all these vulnerabilities together? What is that overall impact? Of course, it's important to understand things at the component and individual level, but this is likely the most important phase. What is that overall risk to a device if these vulnerabilities remain present? All right, we're going to go back to the traceability a little bit here. So vulnerability assessments have to be mapped back to that threat modeling and, importantly, any mitigation. So we'll go through that process one more time. We start at the threat modeling. We're getting all the hypotheticals. What can happen to this device? If we'll try to understand what can go wrong and then what are potential mitigations. What is the overall risk in our mind if that threat is realized? We go into the penetration tests, static testing, SBOM analysis, try to get in all of these vulnerabilities through our vulnerability collection methods. And then finally, we perform that risk assessment. We say, these ones over here are acceptable, these ones aren't. And for the ones that aren't, here are our mitigations. For the ones that are, here's why we think so. All of this should tie together. There should be clear traceability and a clear mapping between the very start of this at the threat modeling process down to the testing. How did we test it? How did we identify it? What's the outcome of that risk assessment? What's the overall score? And then moving down to rationale or mitigations at the very end. All of this traceability is just part of standard risk management, again, going into ISO 14971 and TIR 57 for safety and security. Now, one thing that may apply is we have an unacceptable risk, but no way to mitigate it. There could be some design constraints, or a device has been under development for 10 years and it's too costly to go back and design this problem out of it. In this case, we can document risk transfer. So risk transfer is when we are offloading that risk onto someone else, usually trying to mitigate it through labeling and just accepting that it has to be part of the device. In some cases, this is going to be to the operator of the device or the clinician. In the worst case scenario, we have to transfer that risk onto the patient. One very, very important part of risk transfer, aside from documenting everything, the same as any other mitigation, is disclosing that information to a patient or to a user. They are obligated to know what risk they are introducing by using this device. So if there's a problem with the device, they have to know what the problem is. All right. So that's what we were covering as far as risk assessment. We looked at the overall process, starting in that risk management flow, going from threat modeling all the way down to the mitigations. We talked about what goes into calculating overall risk, why we're looking at exploitability as opposed to subjective metrics, and some of the key FDA concerns. Of course, we're concerned about patient safety and patient data loss above anything else. Turn it over to you, Christian. See if you had any questions or if there are any questions from the audience here.
Yeah, yeah. Some questions did come in. I didn't want to break your flow because you're killing it with your explanation and going and everything. But I'm going to try to stream these questions online here. Um, so the first one should come up on the screen. I believe I would do this right.
All right. So, is the FDA going to migrate to CVSS4? I think eventually. I wouldn't see why not. They're very similar from the exploitability method, and CVSS4 is new. There are new iterations of it coming out pretty frequently, since it's still a little bit under trial. So I don't think it's going to be anything new or anything coming up soon. A lot of what's important with CVSS is it looks at these other metrics for that may not necessarily be applicable to a medical device. It looks at a lot of stuff that might tie in the post-market phase, but not necessarily in the pre-market phase. So I would say likely at some point, but I don't see it as a priority.
Okay, awesome. Let me post the next one here.
What is the KEV? All right, so that is the CISA known exploited vulnerabilities list. A pretty staggering number. There are massive, massive amounts of CVEs, and CVEs are known vulnerabilities in a device, but very few of them have actually been exploited. I believe it's only around 1% of vulnerabilities have actually been exploited.
Only
So,
1% of what's in the CVEs have been exploited.
yep. I mean, every year, tens of thousands of CVEs come out, and the KEV list is, I believe it's a little over 1,000 findings that have
Wow.
actually been exploited. And so a known exploited vulnerability is something with public exploit code that threat actors exploit commonly in the wild. There's a lot of traffic for it. A lot of people know how to do it. Where a lot of vulnerabilities, a lot of CVEs that come up, they're disclosed to the manufacturer by a security researcher and fixed without anyone ever knowing how the vulnerability works or what's going on there. So those are of less concern since it would effectively take someone reverse engineering the component to understand what that vulnerability looks like. Um, Anything in the known exploited vulnerabilities list, it can be assumed that your device will be compromised if you have a finding in there. Attackers just look for anything with the signature matching something in that KEV list, and they just spread out attacks across, hundreds of thousands of computers to try to get any hit. If your device is one of those computers, it might get hit by just a stray attack looking for anything to grab onto. That's why the known exploited vulnerabilities are so dangerous.
A good explanation. We've got two more questions. Here's the next one.
How often is risk assessed after a device is fielded? This should be a continuous process. So, as soon as a vulnerability is identified through any means, it could be a penetration test or just a routine vulnerability scan, this component falls out of date and it's now understood that there's a vulnerability. That risk assessment should happen immediately. So, as soon as a vulnerability is identified, it should be fed straight into the risk assessment process. So, there is no best time to do it. It's just continuous and ongoing as problems are identified.
And this is where our post market management comes into play because we're constantly looking for new risk associated with the software bill of materials or something that pops up in the KEV, like you mentioned, or an FDA notification or HISAC notification, et cetera, right?
Yep.
All this data feeds into our system so we know if there's a new vulnerability for a software component of one of the devices we're managing.
Yep. And then that way we're able to immediately get it through that risk assessment process and figure out exactly what's going on.
Cool. All right. Last question here. Let me show it.
All right. Where do I find a CVD for a device?
Lots of
So,
acronyms. We got KE. I just realized we got KEV, CVSS, and CVD. It's got to be confusing for a lot of people.
yeah. Yeah. I think we did a podcast at one point on just how ridiculous these acronyms get.
All right.
So for a CVD, if you're buying a device, that should be included as part of the labeling. You can ask a manufacturer for an MDS2 form that's going to have information on their CVD process. You can also just reach out directly to the manufacturer and try to get a little bit of that information from them. I know for a while, the security community was pushing the security.txt standard. So that's always worth a shot. You can go to their website and then just go to /security.txt. See if you get anything. More often than not, probably not, but some of the old security teams might still have that going.
We had another question come in. Actually, let me show this one.
All right. How do changes through the device or infrastructure be traced, and does it affect the approval? So the approval, usually when we're submitting into the FDA, we're looking at a point in time snapshot. Um, that is what the device looks like at that time of submission. Of course, the device is going to change. It's expected that devices have an update process built into place, especially now since vulnerabilities may come up and they can't be remediated in the future. Changes to the device infrastructure should be logged through design history files. It's important to have traceability back to previous versions. And so there should be a standardized process logged in your QMS for making changes to the device, documenting what the changes were and what that potential scope is. When looking at the approval side of things, if you have a device that you submit to the FDA, again, this should be a point in time snapshot during initial submission. If you make a significant change after the fact, let's say you add a wireless functionality to a previously air-gapped device, that could affect your standing with the FDA. So you'll likely need to go through a new 510K or, at that point, it would just be a new 510K. That way you're explaining you have essentially a new device. It's doing new things. It has new functionality, and you need to make sure to cover that. I'm not sure if that was exactly what you were asking there, but yeah, that's in short what changes can affect the approval process.
It has to be something that's a substantial or material change that introduces additional risk.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. If you're just switching out one library for another, or changing the color on a login field, or adding a little bit of a functionality, it's not a really big deal. It's when we're looking at something significant that massively alters the operation of a device.
Awesome. I don't see any other questions coming in here. So, any parting words of wisdom, Trevor, before we end our webinar here?
Yeah, just making sure that manufacturers have their risk management process built in and it's something continuously referenced. I think a big problem that can come up with a lot of manufacturers is they'll create this ISO 14971 or TIR57 risk management process, and then vulnerability assessments are just ad hoc. So a risk assessment. Risk assessment should always follow the same process. They should follow that risk management flow, and just making sure that everything gets the same treatment as far as a vulnerability perspective goes.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. I hope you found value in this webinar on assessing risk with medical devices. And be sure to tune in next month for our next webinar. We'll be sure and post the topic and the event on LinkedIn and other social media as well. All right, take care, everyone.